Why is cybernetics so important? My goal in this session is to suggest that it is a radical and revolutionary science, one that upturned the apple cart during the 20th century. Not everybody knows that, so it remains what I would call a somewhat dissident science. At least the implications are still somewhat dissident and heterodox in some respects, but it should not be. It should be absolutely mainstream. It should be a fundamental part of upper school education. It should be built into the science curriculum and much wider than the science curriculum. Everything in school that's concerned with the question, what does it mean to be a human being, to be a member of our earthly world, and how do we grow up as responsible human beings within that world? And I want to argue that cybernetics brings a scientific legitimacy to things that were known before. They weren't necessarily all revolutionary discoveries, but it's brought an authenticity and a legitimacy to certain key factors that have really changed several centuries of assumptions in science. And if we dive into it, they equip us for solving major problems of the world. Very many problems that we have in the world can probably best be dealt with by cybernetics. So that's my thesis, and let me dive into it. Now, the question is, what are we looking at here? And I've picked for my example something that is in the background. You can hear a plane flying over. On the water, you can see it moving. So the water is flowing and it's flickering. So various things are happening and the water is interacting. What you're seeing is, if you like, the marginal case for the standard model of causality in the world. Of all the things that form a borderline between the kind of causality that operates in the field of billiard balls knocking each other, snooker balls knocking each other on the one hand, and living things on the other hand, this is a kind of borderline case for various complicated reasons to do with the nature of water. But if we keep it simple, what's going on with water is it's flowing. It's flowing in the way that it does because it has a certain self-organizing quality, which is why it is a borderline case. But it's flowing under the influence of gravity, and it can't do much about that. It's being influenced by the wind, and it's rippling it, and it can't do much about that. Various shapes around it in the channel are influencing what it happens, and consequently, you find various ripples, whirlpools, and forms taking place. And they are simply the dynamics of forces applying to forces. So this is a case where you're observing in nature forces acting on objects, acting on phenomena, and producing the phenomenal effects that one gets in nature as a real result of forces acting upon. And I want to call this, in this talk, I want to call it passive causality. It's passive because the water and all of the objects that are subject to this kind of causality are passive to external forces. They are not actively causing their own activity. Water is the marginal case deliberately chosen because it has certain self-organizing qualities. For example, it tries to form itself into a circle. It's constantly trying to loop itself into circles, which is why you see some circular forms, for example, appearing so often in water. But in general, it's still operating under the influences of external causality. Now, we need to go back into history in order to understand exactly how it came about that the entire world of science came to the absolute conviction that there was no other form of causality but this one kind of causality. It did not exist in the 1500s. This was not how the world saw causality in the 1500s or the 1400s or the millennia before. It came about as a revolution during the 17th century, particularly. It came about around a watershed around Galileo and various other characters around that time, very specifically also Bacon. Then Newton, Descartes, all contributed to the process in which this happened. Why? Now, you can say that it happened because there was superior science, but actually the decision had almost nothing to do with superior science. It had a great deal to do with epistemes, belief systems, cultural factors that were going on at the time. And this is not a history lesson, and we have a limited amount of time for everything I want to do. So I'm going to dance over it. But the basic principle was Galileo wanted to observe the world, and he was offended rightly by the level in which scholastics had over the centuries come to the fact of just simply believing everything Aristotle said, and not merely believing in him, but believing in corrupt translations of what Aristotle said. Aristotle, in fact, described the world, and he had a key concept of entelikeia. It's a portmanteau word, he coined it, and it's a core concept, and it means something like being at work, staying itself, being at work to the end of staying itself. That's basically what the word means if you take the three Greek words that were brought together in this single concept. And he saw nature, and especially living things, as being at work to the end of staying themselves. It was, in fact, the first foundational principle of what we would now call autopoiesis, for example. However, it got translated in various ways as enteleke and telos and teleology, and it got highly linked to the design concept of God. God created things. And in the 17th century, there were tremendous and terrible religious wars. Even in England, where we had the Civil War, a lot of people died, not as many as in places like Germany, but it was still highly influenced by religious controversy as well as other things. So during the 17th century, having had a point where maybe 15-20% of the population of Europe died as a result of these wars and their consequences, the intelligentsia said, we don't want to have anything more to do with any kind of science or any kind of form of learning, or indeed any kind of religion, ideally. We want to take religion out of science, and we want to take anything in science that still points towards the idea that there might be a designer or a God away. And one of the things is that anything could be acting with its own purpose, because the moment you have purpose, you have design. And it's the bringing back of design which is so important to what cybernetics brings. Now, this you can look up. Toulmin, for example, his Cosmosophy describes this. People like Oakeshott, various philosophers of science have described this. Historians of science have described how this is the case. And the consequence is that a form of science was created in which it became axiomatic that it was not allowed to consider the possibility that anything could be purposefully acting. And that is a plain nonsense. You get to the situation in which biologists and sociologists would effectively admit that in their ordinary dealings, their ordinary thinking, they could not cope without some form of teleology, but officially they could never admit to it. Okay,
nice.
So I am interested in, I enjoy this application. It basically is, it shows images of what's going on around the planet. You can zoom in and out at all different parts of the planet, and you can see wind currents, move currents, and things like that. I believe it's Harry Backer who's here who introduced me to this in the first place. So hi, Harry, thank you very much. So I happened to arrive at this place on this particular day in November, and I saw what looked like an anomaly. So if I show this, you can see perhaps that there is these various wind currents moving along, and in the middle of it, there's a sort of blue patch in which the winds that are being shown, and I'm over on the left demonstrating how you can zoom in and out and you can go to different heights. So when you go to different heights above the surface, you get different images of what's happening to the water, to the air. But there's always this situation where there's a strange anomaly. And the question was, what on earth is going on at that point in the middle of Africa or in the middle of the Sahara? What's happening there? And what I discovered was that there is something like a massif, like you get in the south of France. In fact, it's higher than the south there. It goes up to about 11,000 feet at its highest, over 3,000 meters. And if we look at it, and I wind back and forward, what you can see is this is the wind going to and fro, okay, around this. But what is going on there is that there is a large, massive topographical situation. There's a huge lump of rock, igneous material and so on, and volcanoes. And they're sitting on a base substrate that occupies a space in the middle of Africa and is pretty stable sitting there and is very old. And people have been living there since the 6th millennium BC and building cave art and so on. From the 5th century BC, various clans and people started joining. And what I'd like you to look at is the image of the migration patterns of these groups. There's one migration pattern, and here's another migration pattern. Over on the right, you may find that your people over intrude on it. But if we look at these two different migration patterns, and on the other hand, we look at the air, at the flow of the wind, it looks like there's similar sorts of flowing patterns. But the key is that what the people are doing and what the wind is doing is utterly different. We're dealing with two kinds of phenomena that are happening for two different kinds of causal factors. With human beings, we have agency, and we have human beings choosing to make actions. Right. Here you may recognize it, Liverpool Street Station, and a video I took. We have various people moving through the station. And look at this guy here in the middle. He's walking over lift at the moment. He walks through these people. They don't hit him. He doesn't hit them. Look at these three people. They're coming to hit a whole bunch of five. They're going to have a big collision. Wow, nobody hit each other. What on earth happened? See over there on the right-hand side, there's a big guy walking with his friend, the two of them. There's a man standing in the way, or a woman probably, looking at something. She's checking out something. And what does he do? He moves his arm in, he bends in, he comes in, and he goes around her. He doesn't hit her. What on earth happened? And at the same time as that is happening, these other people are moving through. This is amazing. What is happening? If this was a bunch of rocks being projected in one direction, another bunch of rocks being projected in another direction, or billiard balls on a table, they'd be hitting and colliding and so on. They would not be moving around and avoiding each other. So what is happening? What you have here is active causality. You have agents acting to cancel out interference. And you cannot understand anything that happens in an organization. You cannot design change. You cannot design anything involving human beings, or indeed anything living, without understanding that everything living is actively engaged in a causal process that cancels out whatever looks like interference to it. This is a different order of nature. So we've reached the point where there are two fundamental orders of nature. There's an active causality and there's a passive causality. And these two different forms represent two different kinds of nature. Now, with this, it becomes possible to tame wicked problems. And I'd like to demonstrate very briefly what's involved in this. Wicked problems is a term that many people use today. They use it to mean it's a very super difficult problem, the sort of problem that's hard or impossible to solve. Complexity theory says that all of these sorts of problems are not really solvable, and the general management principle is you have to shove through what you're trying to do. Anytime you introduce a change design and you have to shove it through to get it approved, you basically designed it badly. Because the reason that it doesn't work is that you've asked people to walk into each other, or you've asked people to walk somewhere they don't want to walk, instead of asking them to move around the things that they don't want to move around, or just ignore the things that you don't want them to see. So I want to introduce what's involved in solving wicked problems briefly. First of all, you think in terms of organization and situations, not in terms of systems. Systems are really an unhelpful way of thinking about this. What's happening is that anything you're trying to solve is a situation. And what you're trying to do is bring about an outcome, which is a different situation. Now, the problem that people think they have is never, ever, ever the problem. If it was the problem, if it were the problem, then they would be able to solve it. So you can assume that if you've got a problem and you don't know how to solve it, it's because you've defined the problem as something that's not really the problem. If you're clear about what you're trying to achieve, and only if you're very, very precisely clear, I mean, the kind of precision that has this person walking through that person without them bumping into each other, the equivalent. And you do that by defining situations. And the thing about situations is that situations are not everything in the world. Situations are a filtered version of the world. And I would like to just demonstrate visually, for fun, what do I mean by a filtered version of the world? You should be seeing a Photoshop screen, or rather an image I happen to have moved across to Photoshop. Now, what I want to do is to demonstrate what is involved. What do I mean by filtering? Here is an image. It's a typical wicked problem. It's complex. It's got lots of things going on. There's an amazing amount of detail in this image. All of these thousands of leaves, graphic, this, that, water, all sorts of things going on. But if you're trying to solve the problem, most of it is probably irrelevant to the problem. Most of it is something you actually don't need to take care of. There's the little bit of it that you do want to take care of. And in Photoshop, there are some neat ways for doing that. You can do this, for example. You can go image, calculations. You can say, okay, what I want to do is compare. I'm going to do a calculation, and I'm going to use these criteria within my calculation, and I want to export this as a selection, and then I want to mask everything that doesn't fit, that isn't included in what I want to see. That's the only bit of it I want to see, the green, the bright green bit. That's the bit I'm interested in. And we can do exactly the equivalent in designing solutions to problems. And you can do it several times and filter to get more precisely exactly what it is you're trying to achieve, such as this, for example. Now, I know that's a noddy explanation, but in the course of trying to explain all of this in 30 minutes, I'm merely trying to illustrate a principle that in order to solve these apparently complex and knotty problems, all that's required, I say all, is to be able to figure out which part of all of the situation constitutes the contextual markers that influence how people will behave, what they will consider to be obstructions and what they will not consider to be obstructions. And when you make a design, you create things that has no obstructions. And no obstructions means that the activity flows towards its consequences in exactly the same way as people flowing down through and walking towards or away from the stairs without bumping into anything. That's what you're doing. There's an interesting example that's come up in recent times where people have started to realize, biologists and naturalists and so on, that there may be a solution to the problem of red and gray squirrels. As you know, gray squirrels are sort of swamp the red squirrels wherever they are. And the solution turns up when pine martens come back into the ecology. Red squirrels know about pine martens and gray squirrels don't, because gray squirrels are new. So gray squirrels turn up in some place, they smell the pine marten and they don't recognize that the pine marten is dodgy and you shouldn't go near it. Red squirrels, the moment they smell that a pine marten has been in the vicinity, they're scarper, they're nowhere near it. So what happens is the gray squirrels walk into the situation where the pine martens are, the pine martens eat them. And this is actually doing a very good job of enabling red squirrels to recover their territory. This is a kind of example of how one can create a design, in this case, something whereby the red squirrel notices something, and the constraint is, I don't want to go there. The gray squirrel does not notice this and walks into a problem. Kind of way in which filtering by the red and the gray squirrel produce different kinds of outcomes. Now, what does this mean? It means for the human being that we need sensitive solutions to problem situations, because without them, we'll constantly be creating reverberations and consequences that produce unintended effects. So well-designed things produce no unintended consequences. All of the consequences of design are appropriate. They fit, they're ecological, they're aesthetic, they fit the needs of the different people, and they fit in with what they're looking for. That which does not do that is bad design. Add in the fact that human beings have this remarkable capacity to learn. Like, I see something, I wonder what it is. It's a strange form. I don't expect it there, and I go and investigate. I find out, then I can share it with you, and then you can learn something about something that maybe you didn't know existed in Africa. In this way, we adapt and learn, and we've been doing it since childhood. And what's different about human beings, as you know, is we maintain this neotenic, childhood-like quality throughout our lives. So we have the capacity to learn. This means, I'm proposing to you, ladies and gentlemen, that what we actually have in the world is two fundamental great orders of nature. One, which is determined by passive causality. The other, that is determined by active causality. But within this second group, there's a further distinction, so that we really should talk about either 2 + 1 or 3. Outside the realm that is given by instinct and evolution. I believe my internet connection is unstable, so I hope you can still hear me. Human beings introduce what I think we could call a moral order of nature. Why is it a moral order of nature? Because we have the capacity to perform active causality that generates consequences, and we can choose, we have the capacity to choose what kind of consequences will we have in this world. There is no science that I know that has got even close to legitimizing that as a fact of nature, other than cybernetics. I believe that cybernetics provides that as a legitimation, as a fact of science, a fact of nature, that we have both the possibility and the requirement to recognize this moral order of nature to which we all belong. Thank you.
I've got a quick one. So in what way is water on the liminal edge between these two different types of causality?
Nice question. That was John asking?
Yeah, sorry, John here.
Yeah.
John Hicks, not John, other John.
Yeah, John Hicks. It's because of this. Water has self-organizing properties. Unlike, for example, a billiard ball. A billiard ball certainly has, at some fundamental nature, every single element at some fundamental level, certainly Aristotle would have said this, has some fundamental self-organizing nature. For example, to be copper, you have to have an organizational structure at an atomic level that means you end up as copper. And to be iron, you have to have a different organizational structure to be iron. But the difference with water is that it has the ability to act in nature in response to its contextual environment. It responds to it, and in different ways. So when it heats up and cools down, it forms circles. You find the same thing in air. So the circles that form in water and the circles that form in air through rising and falling to make those circles are fundamental to the whole ecology of life. But beyond that, if you go into space, there's that sort of, you put some water out in a gravity-free space or any fluid, it forms a globe. It forms a circle like, a globe, and it sits there as a droplet. And you see these droplets, if they're very small, on a slightly oily surface and things like that, you get little tiny droplets. As soon as it gets a bit bigger, the force of gravity breaks the desire of water to form these circles. But the winding path of a river on a flat surface is caused by the fact that water is always trying to turn around. It's trying to go back on itself into a circle. There's enough gravity to keep it going, or it turns into a pool. And there's various phenomena around the winding process of the river that demonstrate this. So it's kind of a marginal case, but it's still basically operating passively in nature.
Thank you.
So have we said thank you to Angus for what he's had to say, the end of which I sadly missed. We will cycle back to you very shortly, Angus, when Peter, and you'll have to remind me how to pronounce the word again, Peter. Peter is going to talk to us about sympoiesis, is how the best word I can lift from your description. Peter, you'd like to introduce your own subject, I think.
Fantastic, thank you. Let's see what we can do with all this tech. Yeah, thank you so much. It's a pleasure. Pleasure to be here. I think that set it up rather well, Angus, although we will see how the discussion develops. But I think, yes, it set things up really rather well, and I found that your talk extremely useful. What I'm talking about now is Donna Haraway's Cthulucene, easier to pronounce than it looks. And the way I'm going to talk you through this is in the manner of an exploration. I'm not pretending to be the world's expert on her work here, but I will certainly be working to go some way to correct that, to develop more knowledge as we go through. What I want to say at the beginning is, when John kindly asked me to make a presentation here, I thought about it, and I thought about, in a sense, a kind of home run piece on technology, altered a little bit for cybernetics, or some recollection I had of early involvement in cybernetics or something like that. But in the end, I decided that now is the time for the brave. And now is the time to do some of the thinking that I always wanted to do in a kind of university setting and so on and so forth, which was to grapple with the big stuff. And that's what made me decide to go with Donna Haraway's work. And, I also think, frankly, we, the Cybernetics Society, are not the society for the safe. We're here to discuss big ideas, and I think what I'm trying to do is commend this idea to you, not necessarily sell it in its entirety, but to commend her work to you. Also, at the beginning, I would just say that I want to put some warnings out there, because I don't want to in the short time we have available, fall into sort of obvious traps, or what might be obvious traps, and maybe you won't necessarily thank me for these, but I want to just make some very basic points about Donna Haraway's work, which is, number one, it's not anti-technological. She is not anti-technological. She is opposed to kind of two gods. One is the god of techno fixes, and one is the god of the kind of techno apocalypse. She's trying to find our way through those positions. And I think so. Let's not, because she's talking a lot about ecology and so on and so forth, and she's trying to reject the Anthropocene, as we'll see as we go through. Let's not then fall into the trap of thinking that she goes all the way in a sense, a technological rejection. Not at all, as I'll explain later. So it's not a pastoral kind of thesis of kind of pure landscapes and pure animals and nasty men. It's not that kind of position at all. Rather, what we see with Donna Haraway's work and the idea of the Thulacene is about the difficulty and yet the meaning and the beauty of coming together with other living things, each other, members of the Cybernetics Society, our families, our work colleagues, people who interrupt us whilst we're walking on the street, but also, the neighborhood dog, the neighborhood cat, the insects that occupy our garden. And it's, in a sense, it's about the difficulty, but yet the meaning of all these relationships, and in a sense, a kind of beauty of them, but and making that a kind of primary source of how we see life. So it is something to do with an epistemic shift, So I mentioned also at the beginning that in some of her talks, recorded talks, Haraway cites cybernetics approvingly. She mentions it kind of in passing, doesn't make a big thing about it, but talks about finding cybernetics useful. And she does cite some of the authors that would be known here, in particular in relation to psychology, Gregory Bateson. So that's the intro. And now we fight on. So in terms of some content, and we'll time myself so I don't, I'm not still talking when you've all gone for hot chocolate and to bed. What I'm going to do is introduce the Thulacene, her concepts of the Thulacene, going to position that against a kind of central message which she has, which is staying with the trouble. There's a kind of central, a kind of a motif for understanding the epistemic shift that we're trying to get to. And then the concept of sympoiesis, autopoiesis, not modified and not corrected, but embraced within an idea of sympoiesis. I think I will make that more obvious and more clear by talking about how she uses the idea of plantations. If we're still in time and still going, then we'll move to some of her kind of thinking, advice about thinking. And this, she has this all the time, this kind of lovely use of language, obviously seriously interested in using language to provoke us into new ways of thinking. And she has this, many lovely phrases and ways of kind of dropping in messages in the beauty of a kind of near literary kind of quality. And she has this idea of it matters, she says, it matters what worlds. And that's one of the things that attracted me to her work very greatly, because I'm honored to see Vanilla here today, because I had a chat with your father about some of this too many years ago, but he was trying to teach me in a way in which I didn't understand with my clunky, I wish I could say it was a clunky teenage brain, but I was probably like 31 or something. It was something like that. And he was trying to teach me about the dangers of disciplinary thinking. And I remember that conversation. And as I got into Donna Haraway's work, Stafford's advice to me was echoing through my brain. So this is where we are with the Thulacene. All art is Geraldine Javier, except where I've stolen from Getty. But I noted that. So to start off then, not to be too simple, we understand the idea of the Anthropocene, and in the works there's a kind of an early acknowledgement of the Anthropocene and an accreditation of this that goes to the work of Eugene Stormer and then Paul Crutzen, one a freshwater biologist, one an atmospheric researcher, and how from kind of water and sky, the concept of the Anthropocene, that the human being has changed, has become a material event in the kind of history of the planet. such that its actions are now controlling destinies. So that term comes in to explain that. And researching this, I was surprised that the term wasn't older, because it's accredited really to the 1980s, but as a kind of concept. So the concept of the Anthropocene, and Haraway is not trying to replace the Anthropocene with the Thulacene. She's not saying, at least she's not saying there's going to be a switch, but what she's trying to advocate is a kind of a growth of a Thulacene, of a kind of Thulacene type thinking, such that it might one day be a kind of a replacement for how human beings think of themselves and the planet, and therefore become a kind of a modification or replacement to the Anthropocene. But what I'm trying to say there, a little bit clunkily, is that this is not a kind of a stage shift. This is a migration of ideas, such that an Anthropocene is replaced by the Thulacene. She also highlights what she calls the Capitalocene, which is really, I'm a Mancunian by birth, and so it's my fault, because it comes from the 18th century in the northwest of England, and this almost kind of hyper-aggressive structure of capital acquisition. When we industrialized this process, when we managed to parcel off the land, when we offended William Blake, and when we put John Clare out to ruin, and so on and so forth, then the Capitalocene is this exponential shift in our abilities to in a sense operate an Anthropocene. We become the master industrialists of the Anthropocene with the Industrial Revolution. And so she uses this term as well to kind of highlight our later history. And again, she's trying to see the Thulacene grow alongside and develop and replace. So the Thulacene itself, and I'm quoting from her, is the Thulacene is a kind of time place for learning to stay with the trouble. A kind of time place for learning to stay with the trouble of living and dying on a damaged earth. This is an ongoing multi-species story of, and a combination of stories and practices of becoming with, important terms, of becoming with in times that remain at stake, in precarious times in which the sky has not yet fallen. This is a kind of imaginative way of us making us think about a kind of a new way of seeing, but she's describing the Thulacene as a kind of time place for learning to stay with the trouble of living and dying on a damaged earth. And perhaps you also notice the highlight of a multi-species world. She's saying human beings within the world. So instead of human beings, in a sense, acquiring the world as an Anthropocene, or even more aggressively, a Capitalocene, now human beings within the world, and the human beings become, in a sense, they subject themselves to the biotic and abiotic processes of the ecology, and therefore acknowledge a new relation with what is around them. She calls this a future of tentacular relations. Tentacular or tentacularity, tentacles. This is reaching into and becoming involved in one another's world. We are affected by, and we affect all those that we come into encounters with. And that's not just all us, that's all sentient existence. We are affected by, and we affect all others through these relations. The word tentacular comes from tentacle, of course, which comes from the Latin tentare, to feel. Tentare, to feel. So an emotional relation to do with the connection, the stretching out and the finding of this emotional relation is thereby conducted, engaged in. Always an emotional relation with the connection, whether that be a kind of social human to human connection, or into that relation with the neighborhood cat, or in our decisions about the nest of ants in the garden and so on. This future of tentacular relations, not only first order, but further on beyond, because we don't know, but we can maybe appreciate that if we chase off the cat, or if we remove the nest of ants and so on and so forth, it has some further effects. So this sits really well, I think, with variety, which we all know, the concepts of variety, because I think fundamentally she's trying to store us up to think about and appreciate a higher variety ecology, in a sense that to try and see variety creation in some way, a kind of a beneficial variety equation as our duty as living beings. Sits very well, I think, with what Angus was saying before, because in a sense this kind of moral purpose then becomes to bring ourselves into some sort of ecological relation that has a kind of moral probity about it, by virtue of us knowing the science behind it. All the time the emphasis is on becoming with. You are not alone. You are never alone. You never were alone. You are becoming with. Your identity is a constant kind of becoming with. So when I come to the kind of central message, I think this idea, I think this is really where we kind of gain hold of a raft on the river of her thinking. This idea of staying with the trouble. She's basically saying to me, she's saying to you, she's saying to everyone, and this is a little bit my own telling of it, a little bit my own distillation, but she's saying we could start with domesticity, for example. She's saying, those chores that you have, and the difficulties of maybe some household relations, and building kin with the neighbors and the people about you, and so on and so forth. Well, actually, that's the center of your life, she's saying. That's the building kin, building those relations, looking after household, looking after the garden, building, all of those kind of relations. That's the center of your life, and it's trouble. But stay with the trouble. That's what she's saying. It's trouble. Stay with the trouble, because that's where your meaning is, and that's what you're good at. That's what you're equipped to do. You're good at making all of those decisions, those kind of, taking the prompt from Angus, kind of agency decisions. And so you could start and unpack what she means by this just by thinking about domesticity. But you could also go to the level of the planet, which is where she naturally homes herself, and just to say, well, what the trouble of inheriting a damaged planet, how do we respond to that trouble of inheriting a damaged planet, a planet that needs our help? And again, this is staying with the trouble. Well, you don't leave it, you don't give up, you don't believe in a techno fix, nor a techno apocalypse. You stay with the trouble and you work it out. And this is you in your tentacular relation to the planet, to Earth, to kin. And in that tentacular relation, you are finding meaning, and that's how you begin to, in a sense, rebuild and reconstruct. So it is in this trouble, and not in our accumulation of assets, a point I'm going to come to in a moment, but it's in this trouble that we become. And here we are, all of us, in our domesticity of kin and the damaged planet, and we're all becoming. And our judgments in relation to it are what positions us, each other, and indeed the planet for the future. So if I come now to sympoiesis, Maturana and Varela, of course, the concept of autopoiesis, this kind of process of self-reproduction. And Stafford's, I think it was Stafford originally, his great, clever contribution around pathological autopoiesis. And I've sat through a day of committee meetings at the university. I've seen some of that today. But sympoiesis, so what's she saying here? So Maturana and Varela, they position autopoiesis as this process of self-reproduction. In other words, something comes into being by a fixed set of relations, a process of self-reproduction. to my understanding, humility clause, but to my understanding, what she's saying with sympoiesis is that self-reproduction is not alone, but that process, any autopoietic process, is interacting and intersected by, but interacting in various ways with other autopoietic processes. And these interactions themselves are varied and may have emergent effects. So I would say what she's saying rather carefully is that sympoiesis enfolds autopoiesis. No element owns the process in which it exists, and no self drives it. So I think what she's trying to do is alter our level of thinking and about the relations in which we are manifest, to say they are ultimately sympoietic. The honeybee seeks out the pollen from the flower, and and in that there might be an autopoietic relationship, but that relationship is then fixed in other relationships around the flower, around the honeybee, around the bacteria, around what nests around the bee's nest, and so on and so forth. And these are all interacting with each other, and that's where she's trying to drive us to, I think, with sympoiesis. So a few more points, hopefully make it clear. So we sit then in a kind of a world where we are all the time never alone. None of us ever, never alone. There is always something living is with us. And she uses the term, the critters, and so on and so forth. The critters, what are the critters? Well, we're all critters. All of us, all living beings, we're all critters, high variety. This is extremely high variety. This is trying to understand life as this kind of highest variety set of multitudinous equations. So the critters, the kin, and our making of kin becomes central to how we understand our contributions to life, making kin. We live on this injured and wounded planet, but we choose to stay with the trouble. And we're becoming with all the time, our microbiome, for example, we are inhabited by living microbiota and so on. Our houses, our neighborhoods, the energy sources, plant life, in a sense, it's all a kind of set of kin relations that we're trying to conduct into some sort of harmonious, optimal kind of position. But it's not easy, and it's difficult, and there are compromises and trials, tears, tribulations, doubt along the way. To make it to put another kind of lens on it, the idea of a plantation becomes useful. Here's my Getty image, and the plantation here as this kind of slave colony is offensive, but it wasn't always. The frightening thing is that it wasn't always. Here was a collection of assets to some eyes, and she tries to alert us to this. And the horror of owning other people may have been obliterated or reduced and so on over time, but our basic inclination to build the plantation, she argues, is still with us. We are still seeing the world fundamentally as assets for our own usage. So this also, though rid of the horror of owning people, this also is a plantation. You see a hint of the ecological variety on the hillsides, but what we see as in front of us is not some natural field, but is a massively reduced variety equation, an ecology now made sparse for the purposes of agricultural production. It's difficult. We need to eat. She's never saying these things are easy, but let's see it. Think about the huge plains. Ian Kendrick is here, and I remember him very memorably once telling me about taking the plane east coast to west coast of the United States and seeing underneath farm after farm after farm after farm after farm after farm, all of them with this kind of reduced variety, all of them with this reduced ecology designed to keep out the critters, to reduce the critters, to make them into useful plantations of a sort related to a kind of human production. Once I began to see what she was saying about plantations, I began to see them everywhere. Actually, in a sense, how we've organized the world basically on a kind of resource type model. So we come to kind of a final few points, but as she's trying to alert people to think about these things, she cites Virginia Woolf, and she goes, think we must. Think we must. It matters what stories tell stories. It matters what thoughts think thoughts. It matters what worlds worlds. Think we must. Think about the episteme to which you are belonging. Think about your, in a sense, the relationship that you have with your own thinking and what you have inherited, knowing and not knowing, what you have drawn down about how you understand the world. Are you some sort of dominant entity building reservoir after reservoir of asset, or are you somehow part of the world in some on some other kind of basis? And here I switch a little bit, but I again note the kind of beauty of what she's saying, the beauty of the language. It matters what stories tell stories. It matters what thoughts think thoughts. It matters what worlds worlds. And in order to try and help us think in a more complex way, well, we're not all cyberneticians, so or the whole world isn't full of cyberneticians. So she kind of uses some sort of what I might call, a little bit clumsily, epistemic kind of tools. And her favorite one is what she calls SFs. SF. And what she's doing there is she's relating from multiple different perspectives a kind of single problem. So she uses centrally to the SF is the idea of the string figure, SF, string figure, which is to say we're not in some flowchart relations. We're trying to build string figures, much more complex tentacular relations, and understand the world as a kind of set of, in a sense, through the idea of our thinking should be, tumbling through, building these string figures, seeing relation upon relation, some sort of shape, but ultimately, the world is not going to fit into an organizational chart, is not a set of boxes, is not a set of categories. It's something more elaborate, and just moving towards the idea of the string figure becomes a way of kind of prompting a richer thinking. So string figures, again, SF is a kind of epistemic tool that she's using. She's talking also about science fact, science fiction. Her book, Staying with the Trouble, ends with science fiction, speculative fabulation, storytelling, and speculative feminism, and so far, seeing us so far, understanding all of this as process. So, she's trying to enrich the thinking, trying to understand the thinking, where it comes from. And when I encountered this, I remembered sitting, I think it was a pub garden in it was definitely Winchester. And I remember somehow by some magic, I ended up alone with Stafford Beer after he was lecturing and so on and so forth with everyone at King Alfred's College, where he was teaching at that stage. And he had with him, so there were three of us, he had with him a PhD student, and I think she was from Swansea, and I have tried to look her up since, but failed to find her. But he was telling me at that stage about his concern about the disciplinarity or the curriculum in schools. And I remember not fully understanding or not fully being able to grasp, but to work with the idea that he seemed to be saying to me that to teach history separately from mathematics, for example, could be problematic in the sense that we are, and I think where he was reaching to, and his PhD student was a teacher. Where he was reaching to was that we needed a richer base of thinking. We needed a higher variety mind to meet the higher variety problems in which the world was, as he thought, and correctly so, I think, tumbling at that stage. It must have been 1996, something like that. I'm not really sure, but it's the same game that Donna Haraway is playing, in the sense that where she's talking about worlds. We have to think about what's our epistemology, but also, in a sense, what do we know and what do we fundamentally express about some sort of problem set, about some kind of way of knowing, and will enriching that help us to come to very different sets of ideas and in a sense, relations. I say relations rather than solutions. Relations with the world, than a set of assumptions and a set of ways of thinking and ways of practicing that we don't question and we don't seek to build. Right, I'm probably done for time now. I think by way of kind of ending it, I think. I think it's there to be treated seriously and to be discussed in a way. It's an idea I kind of commend, or a set of ideas I commend to you in that way, to be digested, maybe torn out a little bit. Maybe your understanding is greater than mine. It will certainly be of some aspects of it, but I encountered it, and as I turned the pages of the book and I'd heard her talk about cybernetics, I was thinking, yeah, we're here. Cybernetics is here, and that's why I decided on this topic. Thank you.
Peter, brilliant. Thank you very much. We'll all do the clapping thing. Could you unshare your screen, old chap, please?
I can, yeah.
And then we can see lots and lots of people, because we've still got, we've done very well. We've got 40 people in the room still, which is splendid. And yes, everybody's clapping, so it must have gone really well. Peter, I've got one. Well, other people are formulating there's been a really interesting conversation going on in the chat. So I've written down here something about, I'm looking at what you've described, which I'm hearing as co-evolution. I'm thinking about what Angus said about active causality and seeing those two things as but what's coming out of it for me, and maybe this is in my nature, so it's my problem, the world that's inhabiting my world, is the notion of and the challenge between collaboration and cooperation, which is implied in a lot of what you said, and the nature of competitiveness in nature. We do see in nature competitive behaviors, particularly between living things. So can you explore, elaborate, respond, think?
Yeah. I think she only deals indirectly with a kind of competitive nature. In fact, I'd probably go to some other sources to explore maybe fuller responses to that question. But keeping it to Donna Haraway, I think that one of the things she does is she describes the Capitalocene as autopoietic in itself. And I think that, in a sense, we've probably industrialized competitiveness, and so in a sense pushed things out of a kind of balance, because the Capitalocene works as a kind of probably an industrialization of competitiveness and competitive ability, and perhaps for some years even had some what we felt were beneficial consequences as a result. But then we find that actually no, we need to, in a sense, rein this in. So I think it would be that kind of line of thinking that some of our inventions have then distorted what might be a kind of an optimal arrangement amongst different instincts and natures of sentient beings.
So I'm tempted to ask optimal by whose definition, but I won't. I'll go to Angus instead and pose the same question from the opposite end. So Angus, any thoughts?
Well, thank you very much, Peter. I really enjoyed the session, and my view is that there was a huge complementarity between what I was saying and what you were saying and what you were talking about. I didn't find anything that you brought that I had anything other than agreement with. You only at a certain level of detail, and I was only at a certain level of detail. But I found complementary terms, and we might talk about some of those. Also, things like tentacular and rhizome, which is what Deleuze and Guattari and so on. In my view, what we're talking about, when you talked about this process in which nature is in sympoiesis, living with everything else.
Yes.
Maturana and Varela talk, and Maturana particularly recently has been talking about biology of love. So the autopoietic theory is that every species, and indeed individuals, but every species evolves with its ecosystem. So they co-evolve, ecosystem and individual species. And of course, the ecosystem is multiple different species, all of which are co-evolving with each other in a complex environment. And yes, what they build in is the recognition that there are processes of learning in that. We now, the sort of Darwinian model of random processes over long periods of random change and accidental change is now pretty much discounted in the leading edges of biology. We have a different picture of how evolution happens, and they call that a biology of love, in the sense that there is a sympathetic relationship going on and a learning process throughout evolution. Now, when you look at certain examples, I came across the one of the thing that gets inside a wasp and projects out as the eyes of the wasp, having eaten its way up there. It kind of can look pretty awful, just as it can look pretty awful when the large blue butterfly makes its way into an ant's nest by pretending to be an ant and then starts eating the ant grubs, or when wolves start eating elk. But what we actually find is that the ants died out until the large blue butterflies were brought back. They were codependent on each other. And I think what we are doing is we are using that episteme that you talked about in such a way that we filter out the reality of what's happening in this complexity of life. And we see the things that we want to see. We project our view of the world onto it. And because the last few centuries have been about cultivating a competitive model within human beings, we have not endorsed the fact that there might be another way of seeing the world. Individuals have, and lots of people have, and lots of societies have, and we make rules about it. But you only have to look at the way, for example, the Houses of Parliament operate to see that at a fundamental level, the model for how the world is supposed to work is competitive. So we need to find a different model for a different way of understanding the world, I think. And I think that there's still evolution going on. Life is evolving. And I suspect that what will happen is lots of these evolutionary processes, given another 1,000 or 1,000,000 years, will look very different.
Yeah, I think that's extremely eloquent, Angus. Yeah.
Thanks, Angus. Peter, can I come in?
Please.
Where are you, Bernard? Bernard, you had a question for Peter, I think. You're on mute.
Got it. Sorry about that. Thanks to both Angus and Peter for very, very provocative, interesting, and passionate talks. I love the passion. That's great. And I really appreciate, well, Angus is a poet, but I appreciate Peter's summary of a book. I've read some of the reviews, and he's really summarized it really well. That's very helpful. One particular question, Peter. Does Donna say anything about the population growth that's happening the human population growth, that is, that's happening on our planet.
It's actually a very substantial theme for her, and so in a sense, by the end of the book, she kicks off a story, and she begins to tell the story whereby making kin becomes your primary responsibility. In other words, making relations with other existing sentient beings, multi-species, but human beings included, rather than making babies. And so she's in the end, the science fiction she's writing is a society where making kin is, in a sense, the greater goal of each new Earthling than making babies. And that premise kicks off a science fiction story, which she writes about a generation of daughters called Camille.
That in its way is beautiful, because some of us, well, many years ago, as well as cybernetics being holistic, which is the theme of many, including Stafford, of course, in discussion with Pask about conversation theory, his cybernetic theory of human interactions, I said the cybernetics could be defined as the art and science of fostering goodwill.
Very fascinating.
Just a thought. But
Yeah, very fascinating. Yeah.
Okay, who else is waiting to come in? More questions? There's got to be some questions out there on the basis of that.
Oh, Sally's just said that Haraway's most recent book is called Making Kin, Not Population, 2018. So there you go. Staying with the Troubles, 2016.
So in the absence of other questions, Peter, come back to you on it came up in the middle of your session. Can you explore the difference between symbiosis and sympoiesis, please?
There's a chapter on that. So I refer to chapter 3, and I'm a little bit hesitant to at this moment reliably find the nuances between the two, but I think that I think there's probably a different of emphasis in terms of the levels, because I think sympoiesis is multiple intersecting autopoietic relations. So maybe we're coming to something rather similar to symbiosis. I need to look at that. I climb down with humility.
I think one aspect is she's interested in deliberate, that we start to become deliberate about this.
Correct.
And we design, therefore. And the poiesis is a Greek word, and it means production or making. So a workshop or factory or craft shop or anything like that in Athens, for example, was a poiesis, and what happened in it was poietic. And this could apply to the making of a sculpture or the making of a ship. It was part of Greek culture that it was always aesthetic in the way it was done, and it always involved the various kinds of craft skills that went into the doing of it. So poiesis is a word that draws from that particular root, and it implies a kind of design, an aesthetic design process of making something or other that is useful.
That's very interesting as well, because that implies a kind of movement of agency level.
Yes. Absolutely.
So it becomes moral agency then.
Yes.
In your talk.
Yep.
Okay, so in the absence of anybody else coming, I've got a pile of questions written down, so I can keep this going for hours. So you might want to shut me up at some point. Angus, I want to go right back to the very start of your session, and I know it's a thing you and I have talked about in our battles and debates from time to time. You said it's about solving wicked problems, but you didn't define what a wicked problem is, and you said it's not about systems but about situations. And what Peter was describing was very much a wicked situation, if not a wicked problem. But would you like to sort of explore a little bit more about that difference between systems and situations? So I think that's there is a body of knowledge called systems thinking, and you know, people are familiar with it, and you've just dismissed the whole thing in a pretty short sentence. So
no, I haven't dismissed it. I think that they've got different roles, different usefulnesses. So I didn't define a wicked problem. I said that it was kind of well-known term for a very difficult problem that people don't know how to solve. And so, and then you brought up the term wicked situation, which is, I think I also used that phrase. So a situation is always involves an observer. So the situation that we are on now is each of us has our own situation. And the situation includes what we are paying attention to. I'm noticing, for example, you, and just underneath you is Jonathan Randall is there. His image isn't there, but his text is there. So hello, Jonathan, welcome. So, and I just let him in a moment ago, which is probably why I noticed Jonathan. So it's part of my field of observation. My situation is that I'm noticing Jonathan Randall, but I'm not noticing Andrew Pickering, but now I am noticing Andrew Pickering because I chose to change my field of attention. So a situation always involves a field of attention and the aspects that are included within that field of attention and those that are not. So a situation can be systemically or precisely, scientifically defined systematically as a set of dimensions that are included and can be described as, for example, contextual dimensions. They can be described in words and qualitative aspects and so on, that together compose. Earlier, Peter talked about this process of sympoiesis, of tentacular. So the tentacles, the situation has all these different aspects. And in a way, they are like tentacles. They are the parts that you reach into the world. In the picture that I did, I filtered out all sorts of things and I left other things. And those were the things that constituted the situation in question in that picture. It was an exercise and it was only a demonstration. So that was a kind of model and therefore a kind of system. When we make models, we're building a kind of system of things. When we experience the world, we're constantly reacting to situations. So if you want to design something, if you want to understand something like, well, what's going on with the climate, or what's the likely outcome economically of certain factors, it can be useful to create models as systems that define those in large macro terms at various levels of detail. But if you want to negotiate the actual design of something that deals with the actual practical processes, you can't, you see, as long as a system is using passive causality as its model, this happens to that, and then that happens to that, and then that happens to that, you're not in active causality. In active causality, what you're saying is, if this happens, how will someone respond to that? What will their situation become if I do this? In other words, these consequences become situational for someone else. An organization, therefore, is a kind of macro situation that regenerates its own situations with variation by the nexus, the matrix, the interconnection, the tentacular relationship of the becoming together of all of the different situations of the people within it. I don't know whether that, whether I gave a good explanation. I kind of rushed it, and whether it makes sense, but it's a little bit different as a way of thinking from the normal systems model.
I'm not attempting to judge. I'm attempting to explore, because I'm not sure judging is actually even remotely possible in this conversation.
But I think that it's part of it. What flows out of a cybernetic view is that everything is taking place in a context, and therefore it embeds that there is something happen. An agent is purposefully acting within a context.
But what we end up with is picking up from you and linking back now to Peter. In your explanation, we've got a filtered world, and that filter is if like created by the nature of the person observing it, and it is the filtered world on which they act. But in the Chthulucene, Peter, I was sort of kind of hearing it's an unfiltered world. It is, you deal with the reality of all that is around you in an unfiltered way.
Can I add in one thing? And then Peter, if you could pick it up, which is that I would agree with what Peter was saying about the epistemes of people, because the episteme is a way of filtering your world. So you see the world in a particular way. What I was talking about, though, in the context of situation is the designing deliberately of things to navigate particular situations, which would need to take care of all of that kind of complexity that Peter was referring to. So, but hand over to Peter.
Yeah, no, I think that's very eloquent. Both again, I think great question, and thank you, Angus. Very much kind of on the point and so helpful. I think that the filtering comes in through staying with the trouble and the needing to make sense of relations. You know, there is not a, it's not a just a you know, it's like at one point she says we still want hospitals. You know, we're not. It's not actually an anti-technological thesis. It's about finding positions and therefore sometimes swapping filters and so on, and the ability to filter and refilter in a way in which there's a kind of a. Oh, again, I think that Angus helped very much earlier. There's a kind of learning and. You know, societal progress is reached. Again, I remember Stafford talking about that actually in one of his lectures. You know, there are points at which we decide not to go back. And so I think the filtering is in the practice, and the practice is staying with the trouble. And staying with the trouble is about trying to affect some kind of harmoniousness around things. And I think it's a kind of an embedded filtering rather than a non-filtering.
Okay, so I'm going to get a bit controversial now. I think, if we haven't already. So in this complex system of interacting epistemes, what's the role of the notion of God and religion in that space?
So I think that the ultimate kind of governance of knowing of what is important and what is not is then beginning to come from SF, science fact. So in the sense our Gaia thesis, and then beginning to understand how we operate within that. And again, a bit like an author like Doris Lessing and so on and so forth, the willingness to draw down lessons from psychology or lessons from biology and so on and so forth into life gives us, you know, a willingness to, in a sense, subjugate ourselves to what she calls the biotic and abiotic processes of the planet. And I think the planet begins to take that place, or the well-being of the planet begins to take that place. So it's not a God thesis in the sense that there is a kind of man-stroke woman in the sky type of God, but it's an embedded relation. And then you mutate the answer to begin to say, well, is that an intelligent relation, and is the Earth part of some sort of cosmic intelligence? So I think the problem with God questions is you always chase them on to the next stop. You know, as soon as you say it's not here, you find it's gone to the next stop.
So is God a necessary construct to if you like, to create the conditions for non-competition?
If we're coming back to non-competition, I think that again, I go back to the answer earlier that the problem isn't competition; it's the pathological autopoiesis associated with competition. It's the instrumentation of it as a kind of single aspect of human existence, and that's the issue. So I think we could tone it down a bit, lads, you know, in relation to competition.
So let me come in on that, if I may, as well. There's two questions on competition. I think that the world that we understand to be there as a result of the Darwinian survival of the fittest explanation or non-explanation, because it isn't really an explanation of anything. It's a tautological statement that says the things that survive, survive. And it gives no real explanation of how, which is what science is supposed to do. But what it did, it became such a governing principle that we see the world through that lens. So we stick that filter on and we see the world as operating in a certain way. So we can't actually consider competition until we've cleaned our lens and we actually look at what's really going on without our assumptions about what's going on. And that means really clearing up biology, sociology, and all sorts of aspects of science to make it more neutral. God will not help very much in this. The problem is that we eliminated God from science back, as I said, in the 17th century. The people who were left who believed in God therefore came up with various kinds of explanations of how God operated, but not in any way that actually involved a divine practical intervention. For the most part, at least, there's very few, and they're very dissident, who even get close to that. What they come up with is, well, we don't know how that works, so therefore God must have done it. So, for example, the origins of life. Today, we do not know what the origins of life are. That's a fact. We do not have any scientific explanation for the origins of life. From the scientific side, the assumption is, well, we will find out and it will look like this and it will happen randomly. Why? Because we know that that's the way it works. In other words, we have a presupposed assumption. And the other lot says, well, God will explain it. Why? Because they have a presupposed assumption about it. Neither of those will do scientifically. So we have to actually look at the phenomena and understand it. And I think that when we get back to really understanding competition, we'll throw the word out as it currently exists. We'll start to look at it relative to different aspects of how the human being knows the world. So in the field of science, at the level of thinking, I have an idea. David has another view about nature. David and I, at a level of thinking, can have a kind of competition about which of these gets closer to an explanation to the truth. And that's a kind of competition in the field of thinking towards an exploration of truth. That is useful. But a level of competition in which I hate him and he hates me is not very useful. So we have to become much more nuanced and much more precise about how the world actually works without our assumptions. And I think we'll probably come up with some new understanding and concepts about what competition itself actually is, including some of the other terms around like co-optition and things like that. I think we'll see it differently. And we can.
I'd like, if you will, I'd like to bring Keith Elford in here, because Keith, you put a comment into the chat. Do you have anything to sort of add to this bit of the conversation? Turn your microphone on.
I mean, I think it's been a really, really interesting discussion, and I found both the contributions we've heard fascinating. And I did find I would, because I'm an Anglican priest, so I did inevitably start thinking about the theological implications or connections with what was being said. I suppose I agree that that God is more of a starting point than something you meet along the way, in the sense that it seems a bit hopeless trying to find a kind of God-shaped hole in the science, and attempts to do that have generally not gone very well, or have ended up being superseded by better science. So if we're going to involve God in these kinds of discussions, then I think it has to be at a further backstage, and one has to honestly accept, I think, that we're talking about a position that one chooses for reasons that it's a starting point, not something you can demonstrate in the same way that you could demonstrate, that 2 and 2 equals 4. That's one thing. Another thing is that, there does strike me, nevertheless, that there are some really interesting connections between the work of Haraway, as you've described it, Peter, and or sort of points of resonance with Christian perspectives, which would, for example, understand the world as created and therefore good, but affected by sin and therefore problematic in certain respects, but also redeemed and on the way to some kind of final redemption. And the notion, and also at the heart of the Christian conception of God, and a conception that I think has greatly influenced, especially in the 20th and 21st century, through people like Bonhoeffer, the understanding of or a kind of Christian understanding of the world is based on a fundamental notion of sociality. So you've got a Trinitarian understanding of God in which relationship is fundamental. That influencing the way that redemption is seen as the redemption of the entire human community, rather than simply some kind of abstraction from that community, some sort of notion of heaven, in the far distance. And it just struck me as you were talking that there is real room within a Christian perspective on the world to understand that sociality in even bigger terms, as recognizing and in some way redeeming the entire connectivity of us to all sentient beings and to the world, understood in less mechanical terms. Because I think the Christian tradition has been influenced by some of the things that Angus talked about at the beginning about science, in a way that hasn't been particularly good for the Christian tradition either. A certain functionality, a certain kind of reductionism. And I think what Haraway is doing is actually, from a Christian point of view, is recalling us to our much more holistic conception of the world. That's more than enough.
Some of you may be interested in Jacob and Jacob, their book, The Anglican Origins of Modern Science, where they pretty definitively demonstrate how the people like Newton were involved in writing their science at the time in a way so as to be conducive to protecting Anglicanism in its state order, while nevertheless wanting to go forward with their new brand of science. But they wrote it in ways to try and preserve it. So the involvement of various parties in the design of science back then is really quite remarkable. Jacob and Jacob, the Anglican Origins. I actually think it's quite interesting. If you go into general systems theory, people like Miller, there's they have something which is quite similar, as you know, to cybernetics, the notion of recursiveness. So inside me is my various organs, each of which, the heart, for example, has an autopoietic structure, and within that there are cells which are also living and autopoietic. They're agents. So every cell in my body is an active agent working with active causality in response to its own situation in the world. But I live in an ecosystem and I co-evolve with that ecosystem, and that ecosystem lives in a bigger ecosystem, and so on until you get to the whole planet, and the whole planet is in a larger ecosystem. It depends, for example, on the flooding of the sun and the movement of the moon and things like that to influence what it is. So you've got scales that everybody knows that go down to the tiny, right up to the cosmic, and they're all embedded inside each other, and they all belong to each other, and they're all codependent on each other ultimately for our existence. You've got no artificial boundary for deciding where life, existence, being, consciousness, and so on, whatever terms you use to explore these, new terms, old terms, exist. So I don't think that we can definitively rule out the ability of science to come to an understanding of a level of order that would generally be called the divine, nor to be able to determine that there isn't such a thing, or at least that if there is, it's embedded in everything. I have my own views on that, but for the particular purposes, I don't think we should presuppose what is possible to understand over time through a properly developed way of thinking about the world. Let's have an open mind.
Thank you, Angus. Thank you, Peter. Keith, brilliant. So there's a lot of people sitting in the room who haven't said a lot yet. It'd be really good to hear from some other people and shut people like me and Angus and Peter up for a while.
Yeah.
Anybody else got anything to say or add? I mean, I continue to have large piles of questions here that I feel very selfish for wanting to ask. I'm very open to, and because I've heard a lot of stuff that we could be challenging around here.
Well, I'll go in here just because Peter and I have a mutual friend in Tony Hodgson, and he actually, I believe it. I don't think it's well, I don't think it's actually complete yet, but he's working on this thing called cosmic ecology, which I actually believe answers this question that we've just been discussing for the last 10 minutes. I only wish I had the time to tell you how. Anyway, just being a bit of a tease, but you know, that there is a purpose to life which doesn't stop at the end of the food chain. Yeah, we think of ecology in many ways as a food chain, or not. Ecology is a food chain, but I mean it does have that aspect where people think, well, what do humans feed? They don't feed anything. Nothing eats humans. And it begins from there and goes on, and it's quite an interesting answer, which I think addresses this question. And it's quite surprising for me because I didn't think about it in the cybernetic sense that we're dealing with here. But anyway, just throwing that out there. Hello, Peter.
No, hi, John.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah, I think it would be good to talk about Tony's ideas, but they take some time. And,
exactly.
Yeah. And you know, it's also one of those things that I understand much better in Tony's presence than 15 minutes later. You know, yeah, he's extremely good with them. But yeah, it's definitely something of interest for future session, if I put it that way, Angus and John.
Ian just put something in the chat about I've
done some work. I don't know whether anybody's familiar with Humanity Rising, which is a 2-hour session that takes place every day. They're now on about day 164, and their objective, if they can, is to help raise human consciousness on the planet, basically. And the whole notion of cosmology is of great interest to Humanity Rising. And I've introduced Tony to the organizers of Humanity Rising, and he will be doing a session on cosmic ecology there. If you just search for Humanity Rising, you will find their site with all their sessions, both in the past, they've all been recorded and so on. So if you're interested in that, the link is just search for Humanity Rising, you will find it. Okay. If it's specifically, I'm happy when that session is actually fully booked. If the date's not confirmed yet, I'm happy to share it.
Brilliant. Thanks, Ian. If you let me know through the society, we can push it out to everybody when we have that. I was
also just typing, great session, loved it. Unfortunately, I have to go now. I'll watch the recording to see the end of it.
I'll come back next month, Ian. It'd be great to see you again. Thanks.
I promise you will. Great to see everybody. Cheers all.
So I've written down in the middle of all that the expression, Peter, staying with the trouble. And it put me in mind of an email that on my screen at the moment, Keith happens to be sitting right next to you, just beside your right ear. And Keith sent me a note earlier in the week that one of his students he's working with had asked a question, I've got to get it right, Keith, about the assumption in systems and cybernetics world that you can't solve problems, you can only manage messes. I think that was sort of Checkland's way of putting it. So actually, you can't actually solve the problem. All you can do is manage the situation to make it slightly better. And then when you talk about staying with the trouble, I'm kind of going, okay, so that's actually saying the same thing to me. So are we collectively, individually denying the possibility of solving problems when we have this conversation? I'm happy for anybody to come in on that one. And can anybody point me or Keith at a really good definitive rebuttal of systems thinking?
Can I join in for a moment?
Absolutely.
The notion of a problem is a very interesting one. As you know, it was mainly formalized by Herbert Simon. But in essence, a problem, of course, is that someone has an objective, a future state of the world in mind, and that you try to identify along which trajectory you're going to reach that particular state. So it's not about problem solving, it is about being able to identify what will be the desired future state. And we don't know how that happens. I had another question, but I found myself a little bit overwhelmed by the high level of the discussion, in the sense that I agree with Angus that we have a moral problem, but we also have a scientific problem, how to actually achieve where different people solve different problems at the same time. So it's not solving a problem, it's solving many problems at the same time. And I wondered whether anybody in the audience has been approached by the British government to help identify what the best procedure would be to fight the COVID pandemic. And I have the feeling that now people say, we have to trust the scientists, but the scientists that we have to trust are actually not the scientists that Angus was talking about. So I wonder, is there anybody who has been approached to advise, to help solve a problem, which is not really a problem, the COVID pandemic, but is something where you have a future state in mind that you would like to achieve without constraining yourself to certain types of resources?
Approached is probably not a place most of us have been in. Some of us have been involved in discussions where the core assumption at the heart of government's thinking, certainly in the UK, I can't speak for other countries, is that it's a technical problem with a technical solution, and that there are some very sharp, bright-minded people out there who kind of know what to do. The government themselves, when you look at the nature of our politicians and their histories, I think there's a scientist in government. I think he's in the House of Lords, but I'm not entirely sure. So, of course, what they portray to us as the science very often isn't, and particularly the I'm going to try and say it out loud, epidemiological modelling. I think I got it more or less right. I certainly have been involved in reviewing and critiquing some of the models that have been used and challenging the assumptions that underpin them, and indeed the results that come out of them. But you can't get, and I would say this, wouldn't I? You can't get heard because of the overwhelming clamour of the let's call them the conventional approaches to such things, that what the government and indeed government scientists are adhering to. And as somebody's just put a comment in the box, I'm sorry I just missed that, from Paul, that indeed all the science has been and will continue to be politicised. And I think that's probably a very fair comment. Anybody else want to come in on that?
John, can I in fact come in, because that goes to the heart of what Gerard was saying, goes to the heart of what my thesis was, and I agree with him. I know I'm spoken a lot, but he talks about a trajectory towards an outcome, and I talked about a free path towards an outcome, a goal, something you want to bring about. So the definition of the goal, the defining of the goal, from here I am, where do I want to go, and what's involved in getting there, is absolutely possible. And there have been hundreds of highly complex, highly sophisticated design interventions that have been done and have worked around the world around solving major problems, like, for example, how do you manage to get the entire Olympic team of a major country to outperform by an order of magnitude anything that it has ever done before? And how can you design that kind of an outcome? How can you solve problems of intractable relationships inside social fields? This is possible to be done, and it involves developing what Gerard was talking about. It's often called minimalist intervention. I call it light touch change. Other people have other names for it. It's a core field within cybernetics, but it's just not very well known, and it's very difficult to learn.
Yes, I'd like to say something too.
Please.
I think we can solve problems. So I agree with Angus, and I also think a lot of what he said about situations relates to this. But I think we can solve problems, for example, in organizations, without exactly knowing what the problem is and without knowing what the solution is. And the way to do it is, I think, to indeed get rid of the things that get in the way and let people do the solving. Use the variety of the people in the organization. So you have some idea of what the problem is. You get things into motion and let the system handle it. So you never know what the problem exactly was. You never know what the solution exactly was, but things change for the better. That's what I often see happening. And yeah, it's kind of an art. You can define the problem, but yeah.
I think somebody once suggested writing a book called Creative Mess Management, so rather than sort of creative problem solving, because actually a lot of what we're doing, certainly on a day-to-day basis in organizations, is moving it on a bit, hoping that when we go away at the end of the day, it's a little bit better than it was when we started this morning. And indeed, an awful lot of making sure that the people in the organization are part of the way of solving whatever we've decided the problem might be.
Just come in quickly, John, on the science and COVID. Thanks for your contribution, Ed. And I think there's a literature on that, by the way. For example, incrementalism and so on, from Charles Lindblom, or even what Taleb's done recently on skin in the game. You know, you make decisions when the outcomes affect you. You know,
really important, skin in the game.
Yeah. Skin in the game, yeah. It's he's kind of brilliant without always being original, but never mind. That's me jealous of his book fees. Competition. I think the one thing that I think is quite interesting when we talk about the science in relation to COVID is an anecdote. I'll tell you a true story that September 2019. I was at a meeting in University of Glasgow, and an absolutely brilliant scientist was telling me about the processes of aging, and along the way he was telling me about me and some others about, in a sense, the immune system, how the immune system gets into states of inflammation and so on and so forth, and how it conducts its defenses. And a lot of that, in turn, comes down to very practical things like diet. And so there is a kind of a science and a knowledge around diet, which tells us that how the body can defend itself from viruses. Now, we can't then put up the evidence to say that if you eat this, you will not get COVID. But we do know that if you have certain diets, you are more able to put up barriers to viruses. But you kind of get into a state with the science whereby the epidemiologists can say there is this R rate, therefore it will move at this rate. But people with another perspective cannot say anything as definite of that, and therefore they kind of don't get in the picture at all. But from a kind of public health point of view, it would have been extremely useful to tell people, actually, one of the things that affects your body's responses to viruses is diet. And try it. Even if you've got the skin in the game, it's, it might shift the odds in your favor.
Right, thanks, Peter. I'm going to come in here, guys, because we've got and girls, we've got a few minutes left to go. I was just going to point out that at that point, with that particular one, with the notion of the idea of the Thulacene, and if we treat the virus as a situation, and we're thinking about it's the virus is itself perhaps a cooperative community, Peter, which we have to cooperate rather than compete. So I'm not quite sure how to resolve that one.
Well, I think possibly one interesting line of thinking is to say, well, what's the origin of these species? Is one argument it would be that incursion into natural ecologies is creating these spark of viruses. If we could stay out of those forests, then there would be less exposure for human beings.
Yeah, stay out of the fields. We won't eat the poison toadstools. Thanks again, everybody. That's been a superb evening. I'm going to go and get some food now because I'm getting hungry. But I've really enjoyed myself, and I'm really grateful you were all able to come.
I'm very happy that. Thank you for coming and listening.
Indeed. See you all
And
again
Peter?
next month.
Lovely.
No, thank you all. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks.